everybody. Welcome back. I'm so glad to see you again today. Hope your day's going great. Hope you woke up this morning all energized for a new day. And we're going to read another chapter of Ramona. And this is the chapter called Super Nuisance. And if you can remember, her teacher, Ramona, was in the office, remember, with the egg on her head? And she heard her teacher come in and say, "Oh, my little nuisance." And ever since then, Ramona has been petrified to go to school. She's not sure how Mrs. Whaley feels about her. She doesn't like to think of herself as being a nuisance. So we'll see what happens. This one's called Super Nuisance. And a nuisance means you're kind of pesky, a little bit of a problem, a little bit of trouble. And we know Ramona is that, but she's kind of a sweet little bit of trouble. So anyway, we finished the chapter yesterday where Ramona and her mother had finally forgiven each other across the table. And the girls had cooked dinner, which was a success, and her parents had eaten it, and they had skedaddled off to their rooms while her mom and dad had cleaned up for them. The girls exchanged another secret smile as they excused themselves and skipped off to their rooms before their parents discovered the pile of chicken skins, and the broken eggshell on the counter, the carrot scrapings in the sink, and the cream of wheat, flour, and pear syrup on the floor. So that's good. And even when you're reading your own book, it's good to talk to yourself about what happened yesterday. What just happened in the story? If you've been to one of Mrs. Colby's chapter book parties, that's a question that's good to ask at the bottom of every page, just to keep track of things when you're in your own book. Just before you read the next page, to stop and say to yourself, what just happened on that page? Give your mind a little minute to catch up, tell the story a little bit to yourself, and then go on to the next page. But that's good to do between each chapter too. Go back and remind yourself what just happened in that last chapter. And a lot of times, if you just go by the name of the chapter, it kind of gives you a little heads up to remember. Extra good Sunday. And you go, oh yeah, that's it, right. They had to be super good on that Sunday to try not to cook. And it kind of spurs your brain on to remember a few facts. So, on to Super Nuisance. Once more, the Quimbys were comfortable with one another, or reasonably so. Yet Mr. and Mrs. Quimby often had long, serious discussions at night behind their closed bedroom door. The sober sounds of their voices worried Ramona, who longed to hear them laugh. However, by breakfast, they were usually cheerful but hurried. Ramona was less comfortable at school. In fact, she was most uncomfortable because she was so anxious to not be a nuisance to her teacher. She stopped volunteering answers, and except for the bus ride and sustained silent reading, she dreaded school. One morning when Ramona was wishing she could get out of going to school, she dug a hole in the middle of her oatmeal with her spoon and watched it fill in with milk as she listened to the noise from the garage. It was a grinding growl of the car that was reluctant to start. "Rrr, rrr, rrr, rrr," she said, imitating the sound of the motor. "Ramona, don't dawdle," Mrs. Quimby was whisking around the living room, picking up newspapers, straightening cushions, running a dust cloth over the windowsills and coffee table. Light housekeeping, she called it. Mrs. Quimby did not like to come home to an untidy house. Ramona ate a few spoonfuls of oatmeal, but somehow her spoon felt heavy this morning. "And drink your milk," said her mother. "Remember, you can't do good work in school if you don't eat a good breakfast." Ramona paid scant attention to this little speech. She heard it almost every morning. Out of habit, she drank her milk and managed most of her toast. In the garage, the car stopped growling and started to throb. Ramona had left the table and was brushing her teeth when she heard her father calling through the back door to her mother. "Dorothy, can you come help and steer the car while I push it into the street? I can't get it to go in reverse." And reverse means to go backwards, like to be able to back out of the driveway. Ramona rinsed her mouth and rushed to the front window just in time to see her father putting all his strength into pushing it, the silent car, down the driveway and into the street while her mother steered. At the front of the driveway, Mrs. Quimby started the motor and drove the car forward beside the curb. "Now try it in reverse," Mr. Quimby directed. "In a moment," Mrs. Quimby called out. "It won't go." Ramona put on her coat, picked up her lunchbox, and hurried out to see what was happening and why the car would go forward but not go backward. She soon discovered her parents found nothing funny about this state of affairs. I'm going to have to take it to the mechanic." Ugh, Mr. Quimby looked cross, and then take the bus, which means I'm going to miss my first class. Let me take it. You hurry, catch the bus now, said Mrs. Quimby. The answering service can take the doctor's messages a few minutes longer till I get to the office. Then noticing Ramona standing on the sidewalk, she said, Run along, Ramona, or you'll miss your bus. And she blew Ramona a kiss. What if you have to back up, said Ramona. Well, with luck, I won't have to, said her mother. Now hurry along. Can you picture this? The car can only go forward. She can't back up. If she gets in a parking spot, she can't back up. She's only be able to pull forward. So long, Ramona, said Mr. Quimby. Ramona could see that he was more concerned with the car than with her. Perhaps this knowledge made her feel her feet seem even heavier than usual as she plodded off to her bus stop. The bus ride to school seemed longer than usual. When Yardape said, Hi, Egghead, she didn't even bother to answer, Deviled Egghead to you, as she had planned. When school started, Ramona sat quietly, filling the spaces of her workbook and trying to insert the right numbers into the right spaces, but not much caring if she failed. Her head felt heavy and her fingers did not want to move. She thought of telling Mrs. Whaley she didn't feel good, but her teacher was busy writing a list of words on the blackboard and would probably think anyone who interrupted her was a nuisance. Ramona propped her head in her fist, looking over the 26 glass jars of blue oatmeal. Oh, she did not want to think about blue oatmeal, or white oatmeal, or any oatmeal at all. She sat motionless, hoping this terrible feeling would go away. She knew she should tell her teacher, but by now Ramona was too miserable to even think of raising her hand. If she didn't move, not even a little, not even her finger or an eyelash, maybe she would feel better. Have you ever had that feeling when your tummy's upset and you think you might throw up and suddenly you go, oh, you hardly want to breathe. You just sit there frozen and think, maybe I won't throw up if I just be still. She thought maybe she might feel better. Go away, blue oatmeal, thought Ramona. And then she knew that the most terrible, horrible, dreadful, awful thing that could happen was going to happen. Please, God, don't let me... Ramona prayed too late. The terrible, horrible, dreadful, awful thing happened. Ramona threw up. She threw up right there in front of everyone. 1 second her breakfast was where it belonged, and then everything in her middle seemed to go into reverse, and there was her breakfast on the floor in front of everyone. Ramona had never felt worse in her whole life. Tears of shame welled up in her eyes as she was aware of the shock and horror of everyone around her. She heard Mrs. Whaley say, Oh dear, Marcia, take Ramona to the office. Danny, run and tell Mr. Watts that someone threw up. Children, you may all hold your noses and file into the hall until Mr. Watts comes to clean up. Her instructions made Ramona feel even worse. Tears were streaming down her face, and she longed for Beezus, now far away in junior high school, to come and help her. She let Marcia guide her down the steps and through the hall as the rest of her class, noses pinched between their thumbs and forefingers, hurried out into the hallway. Poor Ramona. She just can't catch a break. It seems like these things just keep happening to her. It's all right, Ramona, Marcia said gently, while keeping a distance as if she expected Ramona to explode. Ramona was crying too hard to answer. Nobody in the whole world was a bigger nuisance than someone who threw up in school. Until now, she thought Mrs. Whaley had been unfair when she called her a nuisance, but now there was no escaping the truth. She really was a nuisance, a horrible, runny-nosed nuisance with nothing to blow her nose on. When Ramona and Marcia entered the office, Marcia was eager to break the news. Oh, Mrs. Larson, she said, Ramona threw up. Even the principal, sitting at his desk in the inner office, heard the news. Ramona knew he would not come out and start being her pal because nobody wanted to be a pal to someone who threw up. Mrs. Larson, seizing a Kleenex box from under her desk, sprang up from her typewriter. Oh, too bad, she said calmly, as if thrower-uppers came into her office every day. Blow, she dictated. She held a Kleenex to Ramona's nose. Ramona blew. The principal, of course, stayed in his office where it was safe. Mrs. Larson then took Ramona into the little room off the office, the same room where she'd washed the egg out of Ramona's hair. She handed Ramona a paper cup of water. You want to rinse your mouth, don't you? Ramona nodded and rinsed. She felt a little better. Mrs. Larson did not behave as if she were a nuisance. The school secretary laid a clean sheet of paper on the pillow in the cot and motioned for Ramona to lie down, and then she covered her with a blanket. "I'll phone your mother and ask her to come and take you home," she said. "But she's at work," Ramona whispered, because speaking out loud might send her stomach into reverse again. "And my daddy's at school." "Oh, I see," said Mrs. Larson. "Well, where do you go after school?" "To Howie Kemp's house," said Ramona, closing her eyes and wishing she could go to sleep and not wake up until this misery was over. She was aware of Mrs. Larson dialing the number, and after a few moments she replaced the receiver. Howie's grandmother was not home. Then the terrible, horrible, dreadful, awful feeling returned. "Mrs. Larson," quavered Ramona, I'm going to throw up." In an instant, Mrs. Larson was holding Ramona's head in front of the toilet. "Oh, it's a good thing I have 3 children of my own. I'm used to this sort of thing," she said. When Ramona had finished, she handed her another cup of water and said cheerfully, "You must feel as if you have just thrown up your toenails." Ramona managed a weak and wavery smile. "Who's going to take care of me?" she asked Mrs. Larson as she covered her with a blanket once more. "Don't worry," said Mrs. Larson. "We'll find someone, and until we do, you rest right here." Ramona felt feeble and exhausted and grateful to Mrs. Larson. Closing her eyes, she had never felt so good. The next thing she knew, she heard her mother whispering, "Ramona." She lifted her heavy eyelids to see her mother standing over her. "Do you feel like going home?" Mrs. Quimby asked gently. She was already holding up Ramona's coat. Tears filled Ramona's eyes. She was not sure her legs would stand up, and how were they going to get home without a car, and where was her mother going to doing here when she was supposed to be at work? Was she going to lose her job? Mrs. Quimby helped Ramona to her feet. She draped her little coat over her shoulders. "I have a taxi waiting," she said as she guided Ramona to the door. Mrs. Larson looked up from her typewriter. "Bye, Ramona. We'll miss you," she said. "I hope you feel better soon." Ramona had forgotten what it was like to feel better. Outside, a yellow taxi cab was chugging at the curb. A taxi! Ramona had never ridden in a taxi cab, and now she was too sick to even enjoy it. Any other time, she would have felt very important to be leaving school in a taxi in the middle of the morning. As Ramona climbed in, she saw the driver look over at her as if he were doubtful about something. "I will not throw up in a taxi," Ramona willed herself. "I will not. A taxi is too expensive to throw up in." She added some silent words to God. "Please don't let me throw up in the taxi." Carefully, Ramona laid her head in her mother's lap, and with every click of the meter, she thought, "I will not throw up in the taxi. I will not throw up in the taxi." And she did not. She managed to wait until she was home and got in the bathroom again. How good Ramona's bed felt with its clean white sheets. She let her mother wipe her face and hands with a cool washcloth and let her take her temperature. Afterward, Ramona didn't care about much of anything. And if you've ever been sick, you're probably having some connections come up with this where you can even almost feel what that would feel like when you're so miserable, so sick, and you just finally get to lay in your bed and put your head down on your pillow. Late in the afternoon, she woke up when Beezus whispered, "Hi," from the doorway. When Mr. Quimby came home, he too paused in the doorway. "How's my girl?" he inquired softly. "Sick," answered Ramona, feeling pitiful. "How's the car?" "Still sick," said her father. "The mechanic was too busy. He couldn't work on it today." In a while, Ramona was aware that her family was eating dinner without her, but she did not care. Later, Mrs. Quimby took Ramona's temperature again, propped her up in bed, and held a fizzy drink up to her lips, which surprised Ramona. Her mother did not approve of junk food. "I talked to the pediatrician," Mrs. Quimby explained. "She said to give you this because you need fluids." The drink gave Ramona a sneezy feeling in her nose. She waited anxiously. Would it stay down? Yes. She sipped it again, and in a moment again. "Good girl," whispered her mother. Ramona fell back and turned her face up on her pillow. Remembering what had happened at school, she began to cry. "Oh, dear heart," said her mother. "Don't cry. You just have a touch of the stomach flu. You're going to feel better in a day or two." Ramona's voice was muffled. "No, I won't." "Yes, you will." Mrs. Quimby patted Ramona through her bedclothes. Ramona turned enough to look at her mother with one teary eye. "You don't know what happened," she said. Mrs. Quimby looked concerned. What happened? I threw up on the floor right in front of the whole class, said Ramona. Her mother was reassuring. Everybody knows you didn't throw up on purpose, and you certainly aren't the first child to do so. She thought for a moment and said, but you should have told Mrs. Whaley you weren't feeling good. Ramona could not bring herself to admit that her teacher thought she was a nuisance. She let out a long, quavery sob. Boo. Mrs. Quimby patted Ramona again and turned out the light. Now go to sleep, she said. You'll feel better in the morning. Ramona was sure that although her stomach might feel better in the morning, the rest of her would still be feeling terrible. She wondered what nickname Yardache would give her this time, and what Mrs. Whaley said to the school secretary about her at lunchtime. As she fell asleep, she decided that she was a super nuisance, and a sick one at that. Poor Ramona, doesn't your heart go out to her? Well, everybody is thrown up, and hopefully not too many people in school, but I know my Tyler has done that before, and he was also mortified, but people forget about it, and life goes on, and sometimes that just happens. So the school secretary was so nice, and her mama got to come and pick her up and take her home and make her feel better. So we will have to see what happens to her. Chapter 7 tomorrow is called The Patient. Guess who that must be? I think it's Ramona. So we'll see what happens to her and her situation with Mrs. Whaley, where now she feels like she's not just a nuisance, but a super nuisance. Okay. Hope you have a great day. I will see you tomorrow. Bye.